One of the most important ideas in biology today is the concept of evolutionary theory. Now, as important as this idea is, a lot of people don't really understand what it is, or if they do, they don't really know how it works. The purpose of this video is to give an introduction to evolution in a way that makes sense and debunks some of the most common myths about it. But before we get started on the actual meat and potatoes of evolution itself, we need to cover some confusion about evolutionary theory and science as a whole. So let's tackle the big one. Evolution is just a theory. This is probably the most irritating myth in the eyes of biologists, and for good reason. It completely misses the point. What this myth comes down to is that there are a couple different definitions of the word theory, and the people who say it's just a theory are using the wrong one. The two definitions in play are the colloquial, or everyday definition, and the scientific definition. The colloquial definition of a theory is an unproven guess or suggestion. For example, my theory about why my socks keep going missing is that someone down at the laundromat is secretly stealing my socks to stage an elaborate sock puppet production of Hamlet. However, the scientific definition of a theory is a thoroughly researched and evidence-supported explanation for why something is the way it is. An example of this type of theory is germ theory, the idea that diseases are caused by tiny organisms called pathogens. Evolutionary theory is a scientific theory. It's not just something Charles Darwin thought up one day and that no one's ever questioned since. It's a well-researched and thoroughly tested explanation for how life as we know it developed on Earth. Now, there are plenty of arguments people make against evolution, and I could make several days' worth of videos counteracting these anti-evolution arguments, but these arguments really have no basis in reality, and it's way more interesting and productive to talk about the things that people wonder about when they're learning about evolution. So, without further ado, here's what evolutionary theory actually is. All life on Earth is related and descended from something called the universal common ancestor. As time went on, over many generations, different species branched off from this shared ancestor, and newer species branched off from these ancestral species, and so on to form all the different species that make up life on Earth. The way all these different organisms developed from the same universal common ancestor is the process of evolution. And here's how that process works. Each generation of a population has some variation in its gene pool, which is the total set of each individual's genes which could be passed on to the next generation. Basically, genes come in a number of different versions, and these versions are called alleles. For example, for a tail-length gene in a mouse, there might be one allele that gives mice long tails and another allele that gives mice short tails. When the frequency of an allele in a population of organisms is changing, we say that the population is evolving. If two populations become genetically isolated and evolve separately, they can become two new separate species. Genetic isolation can mean being separated by a physical barrier, or by having different mating behaviors, or even that the egg and sperm cells of each population can't fertilize one another properly. We see this evolution on a larger scale as changes in populations of organisms over several generations. Now, some people get confused and think that because evolutionary theory starts with this first universal common ancestor, evolution must be about the origin of life. However, evolutionary theory in the field of biology isn't as concerned with where this universal common ancestor came from as it is with how life has developed since the universal common ancestor came into being. There is actually a field of study called chemical evolution, which tries to explain how simpler chemicals could have reacted to form the essential molecules for life. If this sounds interesting, I highly recommend looking up something called the Urey-Miller experiment. But chemical evolution is more of a biochemistry and organic chemistry thing, and evolutionary theory focuses mostly on biology at the scale of organisms and populations. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's more than one shared ancestor in the evolutionary family tree of the world's species. There's a shared ancestor between plants and animals, a shared ancestor between fish and other vertebrates, a shared ancestor between reptiles and mammals, a shared ancestor between marsupials and other mammals, and so on. Closely related species have more recent shared common ancestors that they both descend from, but they don't descend from one another. The most common way people get confused about this is they think that humans evolved from modern chimpanzees or other primates. We did not. Humans and chimpanzees are evolutionary cousins. We have a shared ancestor that lived several million years ago, and we both evolved from that ancestor, but in different ways that have made chimps, chimps, and humans, well, human. There are other ancestors that we share with the other primates, and other ancestors that we share with more distant relatives, such as flying lemurs, tree shrews, rabbits, rodents, and so on, but we didn't evolve directly from any of these modern species. It's all well and good to know what evolution looks like, but it's also important to know how evolution works. There are 4 primary mechanisms by which evolution works: natural selection, mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. Natural selection is the way alleles change frequency based on whether they're useful to have or harmful. Here's how it works. Remember that in populations, there's some genetic variation in the form of different alleles. If a certain allele increases evolutionary fitness, that is, it helps individuals to survive and reproduce better than individuals with a different allele for the same gene, the individuals with the helpful allele will have more descendants than the other individuals. As time goes on, more and more of the population is descended from the individuals with the helpful allele, and we say that this allele is selected for. However, a harmful allele, an allele that decreases evolutionary fitness, will be selected against. That individual will have fewer or even no descendants in the next generation. There are several different types of selection based on which alleles are most beneficial. Directional selection happens when an allele for a more extreme trait is the most beneficial. Stabilizing selection happens when an allele for an intermediate trait is the most helpful, not too much one way or the other. Disruptive selection is basically the opposite of stabilizing selection. When 2 alleles for opposite versions of a trait are each more helpful than an allele somewhere in the middle, each extreme is selected for and the middle is selected against. Disruptive selection often plays a role in speciation, which is the development of 2 separate species. There are a couple of key myths about natural selection that tend to trip people up. One of these is that natural selection makes organisms better and more complex. There's a couple of problems here. First off, there's no such thing as better in nature. All that natural selection can do is make organisms better adapted to their environment, but there's lots of ways to do that, and what works for one species isn't necessarily better than the adaptation of another species. Secondly, natural selection can make organisms more complex, smarter, shinier, harder, faster, stronger, but these aren't always the best adaptations to increase evolutionary fitness. All that evolutionary fitness means is how well an individual can survive and reproduce. Some traits that we like can be pretty bad in terms of evolutionary fitness, and many traits that we don't think are very valuable are great in terms of evolutionary fitness. Another thing that people get confused about when it comes to natural selection and evolution in general is they think that individuals evolve. Now, natural selection does act on individuals, but it's the total population that evolves. Individual organisms can't transform into brand new ones. Imagine what the world would be like if that really did happen. If you went to the pet store and tried to buy a goldfish, you'd have to sign a waiver just in case it turned into, I don't know, some sort of huge, angry water dragon. Now, while natural selection acts on the variations that are already in a population, that variation has to come from somewhere. And in the end, all variation goes back to mutations. Mutations happen when there's an error while copying a strand of DNA, and when a mutation changes a part of a gene, it creates a new allele for that gene. Most mutant alleles either aren't much different from the original, or wild-type allele, or they're worse than the wild-type allele in terms of evolutionary fitness. But mutation can produce beneficial alleles, and natural selection then selects for those mutant alleles. It's also important to know that for evolution to act on a mutation, it has to be heritable. That is, it has to be a mutation that can be passed from a parent to a child. A mutation that just pops up in a skin cell or a bone cell can't be inherited, but a mutation that's present in an egg or sperm cell can. One very common but very untrue myth about evolution is that organisms mutate because they need to. In fact, mutations occur at the genetic level, without any consideration for what kind of impact the mutation will have. Genes aren't sentient. They can't think and decide the best way to change. Sometimes a mutation will be helpful, but honestly, most times it won't. Variation in a population can also come through something called gene flow. Gene flow happens when an organism from one population moves to a different population. Whatever alleles it has get taken out of the gene pool of the first population and are added to the second one. If the migrating organism has some unique allele that the second population doesn't have, the variation increases in the second population. One more mechanism in evolution is genetic drift. Genetic drift is basically random, unpredictable changes in allele frequencies. Genetic drift is more significant in small populations than in large ones, and it's also responsible for something called the founder effect. Basically, when a small group of organisms break off from a larger population to found a new population, their smaller gene pool is likely to have different allele frequencies than that of the larger original group. In small enough populations, genetic drift can also lead to something called gene fixation, where a certain allele either becomes so common that everyone in the population has it, or so uncommon that it dies out completely. While genetic drift and mutations do occur more or less at random, it's important to remember that the overall process of evolution isn't left up to chance. Natural selection specifically drives populations of organisms to become better adapted to their environments. Species don't get their most beneficial characteristics at random. These traits proliferate in the population over many generations because they offer some advantage in terms of evolutionary fitness. One last crucial thing to remember about evolution is that it's not something that happened in the past and then stopped. Evolution is an ongoing process that will continue as long as there's life to evolve. A major example of recent evolution is the development of drug-resistant bacteria. Overuse and misuse of antibiotics has selected for drug resistance mutations in staph, C. diff, Salmonella, E. coli, tuberculosis, and so on. These infections didn't exist until after drugs like penicillin were discovered. Being able to understand how and why germs like MRSA develop is one of the many reasons why it's so important for people to understand what evolution is and how it works. It's also useful for understanding much of modern biology and why life is the way it is. So thanks for watching, and stay curious, my fellow primates.